Hello and welcome to the third lecture in my series on the neurobiology of drugs and alcohol. This has been a series in which I've been trying to lay a basic foundation that will draw upon or build upon in future lectures for how drugs influence the nervous system. We first looked at the peripheral nervous system. Last time we looked at the central nervous system. This time we're still in the central nervous system for the most part, but we're focusing down on a relatively microscopic level, looking at the cellular structure of the nervous system and how different cells within the nervous system communicate with one another. I'm calling this lecture the biochemistry of drugs because we'll be focusing a lot on basic molecular communication in terms of neurotransmitters that different parts of the brain use to communicate. So again, we can consider this just more of an introduction to the nervous system. If you've had a good psychology class or good biology class, some of this will be familiar to you. If not, I hope it will be interesting and will give you, as I said before, a foundation to build upon. I'm once again calling this the biochemistry of drugs because we're going to focus a little bit on how nervous tissues, how neurons particularly communicate to between one another, and understanding a bit about this helps us to really understand why different drugs have the different effects that we observe when people use them. So to begin, the biochemistry of drugs. Here's a really lovely electron microscopy picture of some neurons. You can see them shaded here in this kind of fluorescent green color. These are the cells which make up much of your nervous system. You can see shaded in red some glial cells, which are support cells for different parts of the nervous system as well. Okay, neurons are the main cells in the nervous system. They are specialized cells that have the ability to communicate between one another. Just as a note, nerves refer to neurons that are outside of the central nervous system, and when those cells are inside the central nervous system, we typically call them neurons, but in many ways they're the same, whether the cells are within the central nervous system or in the peripheral nervous system. And in the central nervous system, there are between 100 and maybe 200 billion neurons in the brain, especially, and each neuron has thousands of connections with other neurons, resulting in literally trillions and trillions of connections between neurons within the nervous system. Most of these connections occur across small gaps or synapses between one neuron and another. And the way that neurons are able to communicate with one another is usually by transmitting small chemical messengers from the end of one neuron to another. These messengers are called neurotransmitters. You can see here an image of a typical neuron in the central nervous system. It's a cell which has a cell body. As you can see, it has dendrites, which are areas of the cell body which can receive communication from other neurons. It's got an axon, which is sort of like a long process or branch which extends out to a terminal, which may have a number of different little terminal buds, which can then communicate with the dendrites of other cells, of other neurons. And just to illustrate this even further, we have a nice image here, just kind of describing the flow of communication or the flow of information through a typical neuron. The neuron receives a chemical message on its dendrites, and depending on the nature of that stimulation, of that chemical stimulation, the neuron either will or will not pass along a signal down its axon to the axonal terminus, where it can then release its own neurotransmitters to the next neuron, or the next group of neurons that it is connected to. And this is a little graphic, which hopefully you can see, just kind of representing in crude fashion how at the axon of one particular neuron, neurotransmitters are released. These are molecules which drift across this microscopic gap, the synapse, and link up with receptors on the postsynaptic side, that is on the dendrites of another neuron, where they can potentially activate a new chemical message, and then eventually they drift back across the synapse and are absorbed or otherwise degraded or recycled by the nervous system. Here again is another sort of pictographic representation of that, a little bit better resolution and more information than the last one. So again, we're looking on the left side of the picture here at the axon or an axonal terminal from one neuron. There are these little vesicles which contain the neurotransmitter molecules. Those, when they're properly stimulated, bond to the cell membrane of the axon, releasing, kind of folding out and releasing the neurotransmitter, which then drifts across the synapse and can bond with receptors on the dendrite of another neuron. So again, just a different depiction of roughly the same information. And neurotransmitters work because they are molecules which bond to specific receptors on the dendrites of different neurons, and we sometimes analogize this to kind of a lock and key mechanism, where a particular neurotransmitter is like a key. It has a certain macromolecular shape depending on how the molecule is folded, and it will fit into the surface of the receptor, which is a complex molecule on the dendrite of a neuron. And if it fits just right, then that will change the chemical properties of that receptor, which can then trigger a series of chemical and electrochemical events in the neuron that that receptor is bonded to. So if the right neurotransmitter bonds with the right receptor, it kind of unlocks a chain of events that will follow. If it doesn't, if it bonds with the wrong, if they're the wrong kind of receptors there, that interaction can't occur properly. So this all brings us around to talking about some of the basic neurotransmitters that the nervous system, especially the central nervous system, uses. And in the next few slides, I'm going to highlight a few of them. Later on in the semester, we'll be doing other lectures where we'll be focusing on specific drugs and talking about the specific neurotransmitters which are most relevant to those drugs. For the time being, though, I want to give kind of a basic overview and highlight some of the main or major neurotransmitters that we'll often be talking about. The first of these is acetylcholine. Acetylcholine is a neurotransmitter which is used in different brain structures and brain systems, and often have to do with cognitive processes such as memory. So within the central nervous system, acetylcholine is the chemical messenger that is often used by parts of the brain that govern different parts of our cognitive processes. Again, memory, recalling information, etc. Outside, in the periphery of the nervous system, acetylcholine is also used there, but it is often involved in the parasympathetic branch of the autonomic nervous system. So as I discussed in the first lecture within this series, that's the part or the branch of the autonomic nervous system which is responsible for relaxing or calming the body, if that's a safe thing to do, like after a threat has passed and the body needs to relax and sort of dial itself back. That's the parasympathetic branch of the autonomic nervous system. And in some areas of the parasympathetic branch, acetylcholine is one of the major neurotransmitters. There are a whole class of drugs which are sometimes used to treat conditions like Alzheimer's disease, called cholinergic drugs. These are drugs which stimulate acetylcholine systems in the central nervous system, and thus can aid patients who have memory problems. So if you have perhaps an older relative, aunt, uncle, grandparent, perhaps your parents themselves, depending on their age, you may know someone who's suffering from memory problems which may be related to Alzheimer's. Alzheimer's disease is one of the dementia diseases which are typically characterized by, among other things, deficits in memory. And depending on how severe those deficits are, and depending on the diagnosis that a doctor and a neuropsychologist can make, your relative may be prescribed a cholinergic drug, a drug which is designed, specifically synthesized to interact with those acetylcholine systems within the brain so as to boost the memory performance, which is otherwise beginning to fail as a function of age. It's also worth noting that nicotine, a drug which is commonly used and abused and which people can become dependent upon, is also interacts with acetylcholine systems. And we see this a little bit in the central nervous system. People who smoke cigarettes, for instance, or use vaping tools, that is to say, smokeless tobacco or nicotine vapor inhalers, or people who chew tobacco, or etc., etc., those folks typically report that when they smoke a cigarette or do whatever, that they feel a greater sense of concentration. That's in part because of nicotine interacting with acetylcholine systems in the central nervous system. It's also true that nicotine can interact with acetylcholine systems in the peripheral nervous system, which is why when people smoke a cigarette, we see increases in heart rate, we see some changes in their digestive activity, and we see some changes in their muscle tension. Those are as a consequence of how nicotine, because of its chemical shape, can fit into, or at least partially fit into, the various lock mechanisms that are the receptors for acetylcholine in the peripheral nervous system. So whether we're thinking about cholinergic medications given for folks who have Alzheimer's disease or nicotine, we see two examples of how drugs, cholinergic meds or nicotine, have their effects, that is, their effects on memory, their effects on heart rate, etc., because of their chemical shape and how that chemical shape allows them to interact with naturally occurring neurotransmitter systems in various parts of the nervous system. Another major neurotransmitter, actually a group of major neurotransmitters, are the monoamines. These are probably familiar to you, again, if you've taken a good biology or psychology class. Neurotransmitters like norepinephrine, dopamine, and serotonin. And these neurotransmitters do different things in different places, but generally speaking, or at least often, they have to do with various aspects of emotion and kind of emotional arousal. If we focus just on norepinephrine in the peripheral nervous system is involved in different parts of the sympathetic branch of the autonomic nervous system. So this is the branch of your autonomic nervous system which gets you activated or energized if you have to rise to face a challenge or to fight off an enemy or to escape from danger, etc. That's your fight or flight response. Norepinephrine is one of the neurotransmitters which is active in those parts of the peripheral nervous system. Dopamine, I've mentioned in my last lecture, I will mention a lot later on in the semester in different other lectures, is involved in the central nervous system in various structures which code or identify rewards, which engender motivation, and also which are involved in actual physical movement. So if you think back to the last lecture, I mentioned different structures within the brain which are responsible for kind of making salient reward stimuli, for helping you to feel motivated, and for even allowing you to initiate or kind of begin to coordinate voluntary movement. So you see a delicious cupcake, imagining that this is something that you could really reach out and eat. You might have a sense of motivation to go get that cupcake because it's a salient reward for you. It's more interesting to you in your environment than other things that you could possibly reach out or move towards. And you may even, assuming this is a real cupcake and not a picture, you might actually reach over and try to grab it. All of those responses and activities involve systems in the brain, involve structures within the brain, many of which use dopamine. Dopamine is not the only neurotransmitter involved, but in many ways it's among the more important neurotransmitters involved. And certainly in the last lecture I talked a little bit about the mesolimbic dopaminergic pathway, the so-called reward pathway, which kind of extends from the very higher reaches of the midbrain up through into the forebrain and up into the prefrontal cortex, kind of allowing us to code rewards in our environment, feel motivated to move towards them, and actually activate behavior. There are a whole class of drugs, dopaminergic drugs, which, as you might already know, or as you might guess from the last lecture, can be useful for treating Parkinson's disease. So again, you may know someone in your personal life who has Parkinson's disease. You may have seen on television or in the news people who have Parkinson's disease. Among the other symptoms of this condition is often a kind of a tremor or a difficulty in initiating movement, whether that's walking or even sometimes speaking. People who take dopaminergic drugs. These are drugs which activate or which interact with and which activate the dopamine systems in the central nervous system in the brain and kind of fire them up or get them going, which they're otherwise not doing as well on their own. If you start to suffer from Parkinson's disease, those areas of your brain which normally use dopamine to accomplish those various functions are not working as well. They're beginning to degrade, and the drugs can kind of help compensate for that natural loss of activity. Of course, as I mentioned last time as well, there are a number of different dopaminergic drugs. Cocaine's a really good example of that, a drug which produces a very strong effect in the dopamine systems of the central nervous system, that is to say the dopamine systems of the brain. When people take cocaine, they feel a really powerful sense of mental activation. They may feel euphoric and happy. They also may feel like a great sense of reward in their life, like the thing that they just did using cocaine was really great or really important. They may feel like they themselves are really important or kind of doing something really interesting in their lives, even if they're just sitting in a room doing cocaine. It's easy to see, or it's easy to imagine, how having these type of feelings can be addictive, and people can tend to go back to using cocaine again and again and again because it fires up the reward systems of their brain around a behavior, that is to say around using cocaine, which in and of itself isn't really all that important. Again, you don't need cocaine to survive. Our species doesn't need cocaine to reproduce successfully. It's just a behavior which it's a chemical which takes advantage of a pre-existing system within the brain and tends to engender behavior, that is to say drug use, in a way that of course for some people can be really dangerous. So I know I'm not taking a lot of time or going into a lot of details about these neurotransmitters, but I just want to identify them and give you some simple examples so that hopefully they can stick in your brain. Obviously we talked about acetylcholine, started to talk about the monoamines, norepinephrine, and dopamine. Next up we have serotonin. Again, you may be familiar with serotonin from other classes you've taken, or if you or someone you know takes any antidepressant or anti-anxiety medications, many of these, not all of them, but many of them work upon serotonin systems in the brain. Serotonin, like all the neurotransmitters, does different things in different places, but in many parts of the brain it is involved in regulating mood and regulating aspects of arousal and sleep. So you can imagine someone who is suffering from depression might have might have trouble responding emotionally to the world, may feel sort of distant or depressed or sad. They may also have disruptions in their sleep. As I already mentioned, many antidepressant medications, especially in the last sort of 10 to 20 years, the most successful ones have been serotonergic drugs. So a drug like fluoxetine, or more commonly called Prozac, is a selective serotonin reuptake inhibitor, or an SSRI. The way it works is by kind of blocking the natural recycling process of serotonin in the synapses of your brain, in the areas of your brain where serotonin is used. This causes an excess of serotonin to build up, and thus kind of fires up even more those systems in the brain which normally use serotonin for communication. And those same systems govern things like emotional response. So if you tend to be rather depressed, the theory is that by increasing serotonin activity in these different parts of your brain that normally use serotonin, we can kind of offset the natural depressive action which is otherwise occurring. So again, serotonergic drugs are quite commonly used. They're relatively effective, certainly kind of a major medical success for the most part for treating things like anxiety and depression. Serotonin is also involved in some popular illegal drugs. One of the most famous of these is MDMA, or more commonly known as ecstasy, or more recently known as Molly. MDMA, like Prozac, for instance, stimulates the release of serotonin and blocks its reuptake or its recycling, with the effect that people who use MDMA similarly have an improvement in their mood. Although, as compared to Prozac, this improvement is much stronger and occurs much more quickly. If you begin taking Prozac under your doctor's guidance and prescription, it may take several weeks for it to be optimally effective at treating your depression or treating your anxiety. If you take MDMA, assuming you can find real MDMA, which is difficult to do, and we'll talk about that in a future lecture, but assuming you can really find the stuff and use it, you might have a very strong feeling of improved mood all of a sudden. You may feel like a great sense of feeling like you're in love with yourself and in love with the world around you. You feel like all the sad and unhappy feelings which you might previously have had have just melted away, and understandably people who feel this way might be inclined to use the drug again and again, which is is part of the reason why this drug can be, at least for some people, addictive. So monoamines, norepinephrine, dopamine, and serotonin, just want to briefly identify them, give you a little bit of information about them so that you can think about them and hopefully they can stick in your memory. Moving on, the endorphins. The endorphins are a group of neurotransmitters. They have a common chemical structure and are used in parts of the central nervous system which govern our experience of pain. So people who exercise a lot, especially if you have really hard workouts or if you are a runner and run long distances, will sometimes talk about kind of getting a second wind or kind of running through the pain. You're running, your legs feel sore, perhaps you're doing a half marathon or a marathon, and then after a point that pain kind of recedes. Or some of you, unfortunately, may have been in serious accidents. Perhaps you had a car accident or got bucked off a horse or fell down a cliff while hiking or something like that, where you sustained a significant injury. You may have noticed that initially you felt some pain, and then at least for a while that pain went away or at least decreased. That numbing of pain or that kind of blocking of pain will occur naturally in people as a function of their endorphin systems. That is, the parts of their central nervous system in their brain and spinal cord which use endorphins as their major neurotransmitter and sort of send and receive signals that are relevant to pain. Women who are undergoing childbirth have big changes in their endorphin system to help them cope with the pain of giving birth. This is what naturally happens in the body, and of course it has some real or it has some real advantages for people. So that if you are injured, you're able to not be overwhelmed with pain when you're trying to get to safety or get help from others. Or if you're giving birth, you're not, although you may experience pain, you almost certainly will, you won't be overwhelmed with pain. You'll be able to maintain your mental focus and hopefully deliver your child safely. Now, I've mentioned this in previous lectures, but there are classes of endorphinergic drugs which I've identified previously as the opiates. The opiates, whether they are natural opiates like opium or synthetic opiates like fentanyl, these are all drugs which either naturally have chemical structures very similar to the endorphins in your body, or which are engineered synthetically to have those very similar chemical structures. They interact with the endorphin systems within your brain and can do a lot of the same things, or at least have a lot of the same effects that endorphins have. So drugs, again, like OxyContin, Vicodin, Percocet, fentanyl, certainly opium, morphine, heroin, all those drugs are very powerful painkillers. They're very powerful analgesics, and they can be incredibly useful for treating pain. You may know this if you've had a serious injury and you maybe underwent a surgery and were given a prescription. Maybe you had your wisdom teeth pulled out and were given a prescription for Vicodin or something like that. They can also be misused and abused for people who enjoy experiencing a kind of a powerful numbing high. So I might take my Vicodin pills, like you can see in this picture, and I might crush them up and cut them into lines and then snort them. Or I can even, if I want to, I could use a cigarette lighter to burn them so that some of that chemical vaporizes, and then I inhale it through a straw. I'll get a really strong hit of those endorphinergic chemicals, which will interact very quickly and very powerfully with my body's endorphin neurotransmitter systems. And I'll feel a really strong sense of numbing as all the pain goes away, and a kind of a weird sort of pleasant high. Also, if I use too much of it, I could easily overpower some of the endorphin systems in my brainstem, and I could even slow down my heart or stop my breathing and die. So these can be very dangerous drugs to misuse, as I've talked about in previous lectures. Now, I've identified just a few neurotransmitters. There are many others out there: GABA, glutamate, anandamide. I'll talk about quite a few more as the semester goes on, but again, I wanted to kind of give you a little bit of a preview just now. This image comes from a textbook and gives a quick rundown of a few of the major neurotransmitters, the ones I've talked about. The only one that I didn't is gamma-aminobutyric acid, or GABA, which I'll talk about later. And this figure also, or this table also, kind of helpfully gives you some of the major descriptions of the neurotransmitters, kind of how they work and how they're similar to some of the drugs that we can talk about. So take a little bit of time and check this out. Hopefully it will be fairly obvious to you, or will seem familiar after a little bit of review. And again, in the future lectures, I'll talk about this stuff quite a bit more. Now, the important idea, or ideas, kind of like I've mentioned in previous lectures, is that the drug experience that people have depends somewhat on how that drug influences the various systems and structures of the nervous system, and by influencing those systems and structures, how it disrupts the normal functioning of those systems, of those structures. Now, that interaction occurs as a function of biochemistry, as a function of the shape of the molecule that the drug has, and how that shape allows the drug to interact with the neurotransmitter systems in the brain, interacting with other neurotransmitters, interacting with receptors for neurotransmitters, and so on. Now, I've given you a lot of information. Hopefully I've given you a lot of fun or interesting stuff to think about. I'm going to link to a website called Mouse Party, which is run out of the University of Utah, I believe. It's a kind of an interactive sort of cartoon game where you simulate, in a very sort of loose and cartoony sense, drug research with rats, or I guess with mice. What you can do is you can look at a group of mice, and you can look at the effects that different drugs have on them as a function of the basic biochemistry of those drugs. So you can either follow the link that I'll put on Blackboard, or I'm sure if you just type Mouse Party into Google, you'll get this as your first hit. It's kind of fun. It's definitely kind of an interesting way to review some of the stuff we've learned about neurotransmitters, and it gives us some information about specific drugs and how they affect different neurotransmitter systems. As I've already said, much of that information I'll touch on in greater and more specific detail in future lectures. But for the time being, I think it's well worth you taking a little bit of time out, fiddling around with this computer game. It's sort of fun. Again, I think you'll enjoy it. And then once you're done, we'll just kind of get ready for our next lecture. As a preview, I'll be transitioning from talking about neurobiology and biochemistry to talking a little bit about pharmacology, specifically pharmacokinetics. That is, simply put, the study of how drugs get into and out of the body. I want to talk a little bit about that, and also talk a little bit about drug testing, a related and important issue. In the lectures that follow, I'll talk more about pharmacology, including some elements of pharmacodynamics, looking at why and how people respond to different drugs, why there are individual differences in how people respond to drugs, and so on. But for the time being, think about the material we've just covered. Take some time to interact with or to check out some of the links that I'll post on Blackboard. And then once you're all done, take a few minutes to relax, take the afternoon off if you can, and when you're ready, come back for the next lecture. As I always say, thank you very much for your attention, and I'll see you next time around.